Hello and greetings from UB. On behalf of the Office of Alumni Engagement and the UB School of Management, I am happy you are able to join us for today's webinar presentation. My name is Joy Rona and I'm a member of the Lifelong Engagement Tier here at the Office of Alumni Engagement. Since 1923, the UB School of Management has been developing leaders and making an impact on individuals, businesses, and communities around the world. In their mission to define the future of management, Dean Iyer has unified the school around 4 distinct areas of focus: the business of climate change, business analytics, social impact of management, and innovation, entrepreneurship, and leadership. Each of these initiatives are helping to realize their vision of a world of transformational leaders and organizations who change the society for better. Today, we are excited to welcome our featured presenter, Dominik Roesch. Dominik is an associate professor in finance at the UB School of Management, and his research focuses on market quality, in particular, investigating the joint dynamics of arbitrage, liquidity, and efficiency. Several of his papers have been published or are forthcoming in the top 3 finance journals, including the Journal of Finance, the Journal of Financial Economics, and the Review of Financial Studies. He has been part of an NSF infrastructure grant, which allowed him to build up a framework based on OneTick software to efficiently analyze financial data. Before finishing his PhD at Erasmus University, he worked as a quantitative analyst in Germany, Malta, and Malaysia. He has the equivalent of a master's degree in mathematics from the University of Bonn and a master in finance from the University of London. Today, we ask the question, why is it difficult to make good choices? Dominik argues that making the right choice is difficult for at least 3 reasons. We might lack knowledge to properly evaluate alternatives. We might lack understanding of how to evaluate them, and we might lack rationality. When analyzing each of these challenges, we will answer questions such as, what is the difference between testing positive for COVID and having COVID? We will leave time today during the webinar for Q&A. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them through the GoToWebinar taskbar. There's a question section on your screen. You can chat those to us at any time. In addition, we are recording today's session and we'll send you all a copy within the next 24 hours. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to today's featured presenter, Dominik Roesch.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. And thank you everyone for coming and joining the talk. Today, I want to first talk about my research as mentioned in the introduction. I investigate market efficiencies and arbitrage opportunities, how they relate and how they are related to other outcomes we want from markets. I want to give you one example of such an arbitrage opportunity. It's the price gap between AMC stocks and APE stocks. So AMC was one of the so-called meme stocks that significantly increased in price at the beginning of 2021. The CEO made good use of it by issuing more and more shares. But at some point, the CEO reached the limit of how many shares could be issued, and he asked the existing shareholders whether they would allow to increase this limit. The shareholders declined, but the CEO found another way of doing so. Instead of issuing so-called common stocks, AMC stocks, he issued APE shares, which are preferred stocks. So the importance is that one APE stock is the same in terms of voting rights and in cash flow rights as one AMC stock. So considering the law of one price, both of them should trade at the same price. At the beginning, the CEO also mentioned that he probably will ask and will convert the APE shares to AMC shares at some point in the future. Another reason why they should trade at the same point, at the same price. So now, if we look at the price of AMC stocks, which is in the time series shown, the blue graph at the top, and the price gap between APE and AMC, we see that regardless of the price of AMC, the difference was always significantly positive. At the beginning, when the share just started trading, the difference was almost zero, as it should be, but then as time progressed, the difference got bigger and bigger, reaching $7.50 in around August 22. At that point, AMC was worth $15, but Ape shares were priced at $7.50. So that might sound like a big price gap, and it is, but it even got bigger in terms of proportional amount. So when you look at the time around December 22, you see that AMC was priced at $7.50, and the difference is almost also $7.50. So at that point, you could buy one Ape share for 50 cents, even though AMC was worth $7.50. So there's a lot of details in the graph, why there are differences in prices, why they moved up, why they moved down. I don't want to go too much in the details, but important questions whenever you have a seemingly profitable arbitrage or profitable investment strategy at all, you should ask yourself, why did the price gap rise? What caused this happening? And why does the price gap persist? So why do people not trade against it? So one reason why they don't trade against it is that it's very difficult. So if you want to make use of the arbitrage, you would buy the undervalued stock, so the Ape stock in this example, and you would short sell the overvalued stock, AMC. But short selling is difficult for a couple of reasons. Here, you would need to borrow the shares, but often when the price gap was very big, there were no shares available for borrowing. And also the borrowing costs are extremely high. So at some point, the borrowing cost of borrowing one AMC share for 1 year would be 3 times the price of how much the AMC stock is priced. In other words, 3 times the maximum you could gain. So when you think about arbitrage opportunities in a broader sense, well, they are created by mistakes. Someone must misevaluate the situation, whether that causes the price gap to arise or whether that causes the price gap to persist. So what does it actually mean, a mistake? So I take the definition from Merriam-Webster, a wrong action or statement proceeding from faulty judgment, inadequate knowledge, or inattention. So that brings me to the 3 different explanations why mistakes might arise, why it's so difficult to make good choices. So the first is that we might lack knowledge, we might lack understanding, and we might lack rationality. So for example, if you think about the AMC Ape gap, well, you might not even have heard about it before. Second, lack of understanding, as I mentioned, there's a lot of details that you would need to consider. For example, you need to be able to short sell. You need to consider the transaction costs, the fee. Lack of rationality is something that I will come back at the end, and it also refers to the meme craze. So instead of going more into the direction of my research and arbitrage opportunities, I want to give you some more general questions that I wish I could answer. I can't, but I can give you some flavors of why they are also difficult to answer. So the first one is nuclear power good? Will AI take over the world? Are researchers good teachers? Should mammograms start at age 40? And related to that, if I test positive for COVID, do I have COVID? And the last question, why are people poor? So as I said before, I wish I could answer any of these questions. They're obviously all very difficult, but I hope I can give you at least an idea of why they are so difficult to answer. So the first one, the lack of knowledge. Let me quote Socrates, I know that I know nothing. So if you think about gambling, most people think of gambling as a losing bet. It's based by chance. The house always has its odds in its favors, but not always. So think about blackjack. Blackjack is a card game where you're trying to get as close as possible to 21 points. If you get over, you bust, you lost. And the one who gets closest, well, they will win. So now you might think that this is just based on luck. But if you see the stack of cards in the top left corner, you see their finite number of cards. And now if you count the cards that have been played, that might give you an edge in the game. And that's exactly what Ed Thorpe, the inventor of card counting, did. So at that time, the stack was much lower. They didn't shuffle that often. And there was a lot of benefits from counting how many high and how many low cards are still in the deck can be played. This obviously doesn't predict the next hand, but it can give you an edge. And an edge is all that you need to be able to beat the house. And that is not only true in blackjack. Most of the gambling have some kind of quirks that you might be able to exploit. So for example, in lottery, they had like so-called roll downs. When the jackpot reached a certain amount, they pushed down the jackpot to the lower stake wins, which pushed up the expected value of any lottery ticket above how much it is traded for. So in other words, you suddenly could make money playing the lottery. It's also true in roulette. Roulette also looks like a game of chance, but at the end, there's a lot of physics involved as well. If you have like a supercomputer that can analyze the trajectory of the ball, can analyze how the ball ends up in the disc and so on, you might get an edge. And again, an edge is all that is needed to be able to beat the odds. There's a great book by Sloan and Fernbach, The Knowledge Illusion, Why We Never Think Alone. And I just want to quote two from a review in The Economist. The limitations of mind are no surprise, but the problem is that people so rarely think about them. Be skeptical of your own knowledge and the wisdom of your crowd. So again, the idea that we are often too confident in our own knowledge might lead us to mistakes. Let me make one example about something that you might have heard before, the idea that compounding is like magic. So if you have a bank account and you get an interest on the interest, so in other words, your interest compounds, you get rich pretty quickly. It's an exponential growth. And that is true, but not always. So imagine the following profit opportunity. Imagine you invest in an asset where you can gain 11% or you lose 10%, and it's determined by a coin flip. So every day there's a coin flip. If it's head, you get 11%. If it's tail, you lose 10%. If you would rather buy and hold, so that means you let the returns compound, or whether you hold and sell every day, day trade, it really depends which strategy you follow about the profits you can be able to make. So the easiest way to see that if you let the returns compound, that you end up losing everything, is by changing the payoff slightly. So imagine you have an asset that pays off 500% or it loses 100%. So you see, because of the fact that you can lose everything, it doesn't matter what the asset returns. Once in a while, you will lose everything. That might happen after one day, it might happen after 10 days. But the probability that it will happen at some point is 1. And once you lost everything, well, your return is minus 100%. So you see, if the asset is risky, compounding might actually not be always good. So the idea of compounding, or interest rates in general, is also important when you want to evaluate whether nuclear power is good or bad. One problem with nuclear power is that it generates waste that lasts for thousands of years. So this example, the numbers I made up, but the technologies are roughly based on a real life. So there are two different technologies, E and U, and let's say they have the same cash flow. They generate the same amount of energy. E has an initial cost of $1,000, but it produces waste for 2 million years, and the storing the waste costs $1 per year. The other technology costs X and only produces waste for 2,000 years. Also, storing the waste costs $1 per year. So now, if you want to calculate the net present value of both, and you want to estimate X so that the net present value is the same for both technologies, what would you come up with? Well, we know that we need to take the present value of all the cash flows. And now if you discount $1 with any positive interest rate, if the discounting is 2,000 years or more, the discounted value is pretty much zero. So in other words, you would not be willing to pay any cent or even less than a cent to save like almost 2 million years of garbage. So the problem here is that the discounting makes all the future cash flows in present terms have a value of zero. All right, so the knowledge is important. We need to know the ins and outs of what we want to answer. There's also other problems that we need to be able to take the right inferences. Quoting Kant, dare to think. So the lack of understanding is important. If you read newspaper articles, it's very common that people misinterpret correlations as causation. It even is more dangerous than that, because you can have a positive correlation in the whole sample, but in a negative correlation in every single subsample, which is called the Simpson's paradox. The other importance is that we, in research or in tests, we normally only have the probability that we find an evidence given that the hypothesis is true, but in real life, we want the opposite. So we want the probability that the hypothesis is true given the evidence. So if this sounds all very abstract, well, it is, but I will give you a couple of examples to explain these different issues. So the first one, I mean, will AI take over the world? At least up to now, AI only figures out correlation. It figures it out in a very sophisticated way, but it doesn't really address causality yet. So this is a controversial idea, at least since Fisher, Pearson, and others. Often people think that data can tell you something, but data by itself doesn't work. Data by itself can't tell you anything. And that is related to the problem that we can only get correlations out of data. So let's think we want to answer whether people are poor because we help them too much. So to answer that, well, let's look at a scatter plot where we put on the x-axis, we put how much aid we give everyone. And on the y-axis, we put a measure of income. So this graph shows you the aid per person over the GDP per country. And you see that there's a clearly negative correlation. So to answer my question, yeah, clearly. I mean, the more aid they get, the poorer they are. So in other words, we make people poor by helping them. Well, obviously, that's not the case. So here, the problem is, again, it's a correlation, it's not a causation. So if you think about causal impact, it would be just the opposite. We obviously help people because they are poor. But from a data perspective, we don't see the difference. From a data perspective, we don't see whether the x-axis causes the y-axis or the other way. As I mentioned, it can be even worse. So if you have an experiment where you investigate how exercise affects cholesterol levels, you might end up with the big scatter plot shown as the positive correlation, where you see that more exercise actually increases cholesterol, which seems very unintuitive. And it is, because the problem here is that you have that age is an important control variable. When you control for the age, you do see that the exercise actually decreases cholesterol. But from a purely data perspective, you don't know whether you need to look at the whole sample, in which case the correlation would be positive, or whether you need to look at each subsample, in which case the correlation would be negative. So again, here we would need to control for H because it's a confounder. It affects both the treatment and the outcome. So controlling sounds like a great idea, but the problem is that sometimes when you control for something, it can actually misfire. Let me give you an example, which is based on the Monty Hall problem. You might have come across the Monty Hall problem before. It's like one of the most cited problems in conditional probability. So the idea is that there's a game show with 3 different doors, A, B, and C. And only one door has some kind of price behind it, and the other one has nothing. So now the contestant chooses a door, let's say chooses door A. The game show master, he can now, or he will now, choose a door not chosen by the contestant, opens it and reveals that the door does not contain the price. So let's say you choose door A, you think the price is behind door A, and now I can choose door B or C. I know where the price is, so I will not open the door with the price. So I could choose, for example, door B. And then I can ask, or the game show master asks the contestant whether she wants to switch from A to C or not. So when you hear that the first time, most people think that it doesn't really matter whether you switch. Probability should move from 1/3 initially. Now I open door B, should be 1/2. But that's actually not the case. When you open, or when I open door B, the probability is obviously 0. But the important part here is that the probability of the other door actually becomes 2/3. One very easy way to see that is if you think about a 1,000 door. You choose one, I open 998. Is it worth it to switch or not? You can also go through like an experiment where you just simulate it, or you can look at the 3 alternatives. Think about A can contain the gold, B can contain the gold, or C can contain the gold. Only in the first one, so if you choose the door with the gold, only in this case, it's bad to switch. In both other cases, it's actually good to switch. In other words, saying it that the probability that you get the price if you don't switch is only 1 out of 3. So it's better to switch. There's many explanations, you can look on YouTube, many explanations that go in these directions. Another important part of it is actually why it's surprising in the first place. So initially, the choice of the door and where the gold is uncorrelated. But what now happens is that the game show master, he chooses the door based on A and G. And that conditions and makes A and G correlated. So there's no causation, but they become correlated because of the choice of the door M. And this is called a collider bias. So let me give you some more examples about so-called collider bias. So think about whether mammograms should start at age 40 or whether researchers are good teachers. So initially we might think, well, it's probably uncorrelated. Let's say research and teaching skills might be uncorrelated, or whether you screen. Screening certainly doesn't decrease cancer. If at anything, it might slightly increase the chance of having cancer. But now, when you look at your data, what you find is that you find a negative correlation. And that might seem surprising at first. It is, at least it was surprising for me. So I did look at whether research and teaching skills are positively correlated, and I did find a negative correlation. After a while, I figured out that it's actually the same example as the example I just gave you with Monty Hall. It's a so-called collider bias. So the problem is that in a sample, you will lose the whole left bottom of observation. Why? Well, think of who does research and who does teaching. These ones are normally professors, but someone who is not good in research and not good in teaching, he will not be a professor. He will not enter the sample. Same thing when you just look at the population of who has cancer and who does screening, you will miss out the whole sample that doesn't have cancer and that doesn't go for screening. And because of that, you see, if you fit a line through this scatter plot now, you will see a negative correlation. So again, it is a collider bias, and you need to be careful that you don't control for something that you better don't control for. So when I saw this graph from The Economist, I was quite surprised by, well, as the title says, the odd man out. So you see that on the x-axis, it shows you the health spending per person, and on the y-axis, it shows you life expectancy. So you see that the United States has actually quite high high healthcare spending without much increase in the life expectancy. So one thing initially, what I thought is that it might be because the US does not do much preventive screening. Well, that's probably not completely true. It's true for a subsample of the population who doesn't have health insurance. So if you compare that to most other countries, health insurance is mandatory, and therefore everyone does preventive screening, goes regular to the doctor, and so on. But going back to the question of whether it's good to have mammograms at the age of 40, there might also be a downside of too much screening, too much prevention. So it's a general concept. Well, not every curve is aligned. So it's based on this idea of a Laffer curve. So you probably have a trade-off. If you don't have any preventions, well, then there are no benefits of it. But if you have too many preventions, there might also be no benefit. So why is that? Let me go to the last example to explain why too many preventions might also decrease benefit. So if you test positive for COVID, what is actually the chance that you have COVID? So obviously you can replace COVID with any other test. You can also replace it with tests in academic papers, whether it's a p-value, t-stat, or so on. So to answer the question, what is the chance that you have COVID? The most important part is actually the base rate. So out of 100 people, how many people do have COVID? Let's say only one person. So out of 100, one person has COVID. So now you want to test. So you test all the 100 people of whether they have COVID or not. Let's say your test is really, really good. So the test identifies everyone who has COVID as having COVID. So that means everyone who has COVID will test positive. And the test is also very good in terms of the 99 people that do not have COVID, it will identify almost 100%. So let's say it identifies 98 out of 99 that don't have COVID. But that means there is one error, which I indicate by the green square. It's a false positive. So we identified out of the 99 that do not have COVID, we identified 98. But that means we identified one person as having COVID, even though he does not have COVID. So that's a false positive. So again, the test is very good. It identifies everyone who has COVID as having COVID. So the test is positive if you have COVID. And it's also very good in terms of that it identifies almost everyone who doesn't have COVID. But now the question is, what's the probability that you have COVID given that you tested positive? Well, in this case, we can drop the whole sample and just focus on the ones that tested positive and that actually have COVID. So we tested, out of the 100 people, we tested 2 people positive, but only one of them actually has COVID. So that means the probability of having COVID, given that you tested positive, is just 1/2, 50%. And that's very important if you think about any kind of test for a rare disease, and why often these population screenings can have much more downsides than benefits. So imagine you have a rare disease with only 1 out of a million person is affected. If your test is so good that it identifies 999,998 that don't have that, well, then you still have a false positive of 1. That means, again, you have a probability that you have the disease, even though you tested positive, is just 50%. And that, again, has very important implications for medical tests. It also has very important implications in law and in other areas. So the last I want to mention is the dare to disagree. Maybe we lack rationality in figuring out how to avoid mistakes, how to make good choices. So one problem with making choices is that we often don't do choices alone. After all, we live in a community, and we might not always want to make a choice that goes against the ideas of the community. So the other way of saying it, it might be tribalism. So this great book by Pinker, it's called Rationality, that goes in this direction, and it explains what he actually means by rationality and why we might sometimes lack it. There's also a great book in finance, or more related to finance, by Metric, the Antisocial Network, and it explains how GameStop and the meme stock craze, how it started, and it tells you a lot about how the people that invested in these stocks, what they thought. I think the book provides a great case study, how we might lack knowledge, how the lack of understanding and the need for tribalism might lead or might have led to the meme stock craze and other mispricings in financial markets. So let me summarize. Why is it so difficult to make good choices? Probably because of all three. Sometimes we just lack the knowledge. We might overestimate our own knowledge. We also might be more driven by recent events, the so-called availability bias. We might lack understanding, so we might not always be able to interpret the data in the right way. Think of mixing up correlations with causations. Think about this example of what the probability is that you have COVID, given that it tested positive, which, by the way, is called Bayesian updating. And the last potential reason is that sometimes we might not even want to make the right or the correct choice, just because we follow what other people do. If you're interested in these areas, I can recommend you a couple of books, and especially the book by Gilgerenzer, Risk Savvy, How to Make Good Decisions, and the book by Pinker that I mentioned before, Rationality, What It Is, Why It Seems Scarce, and Why It Matters. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Dominik. I am overwhelmed, I think is the best word. Really, really deep conversation here about decision making, and I saw more math than I ever thought I would see on a conversation about choices, but it all made sense to me. So thank you very much for sharing that. So I have a question personally. So while we're doing a little bit of conversation, please submit your questions using your question section of your GoToWebinar taskbar, and we'll continue on with as many questions as we have, the time allows. So Dominik, I think, so knowledge and understanding, I feel like are the two of the three that have the possibility of being solved relatively easily. If you don't have the knowledge, you can go get it. If you don't know how to interpret the data, there's ways for you to learn how to do that, right? Those are things you could learn. But the rationality seems to me, maybe you could talk a little bit more about the rationality. That seemed a little more, not quite so cut and dry. Not that anything is cut and dry in when making a decision. But the rationality seemed like there didn't seem, as I was listening, I was like, well, knowledge, go get it. Interpretation, you could read more about it. How do I continue on with rationality, I guess is my question.
So, I mean, if you think actually about decisions, I mean, in hindsight, all that sounds easy, right? I mean, you could get the knowledge, but it's really tricky. Even the first one is very tricky. So think about September 11. I mean, when the plane hit the Twin Towers, which was obviously a great disaster. But everybody was so scared of flying that everyone started driving. But at the end, driving is much more risky than flying. And everybody could get the knowledge, but still people decided to drive because of the event where the plane crashed. But then, I mean, researchers estimate that because of this decision, much more people actually died because they started driving, but driving is much more risky. So I looked at the stats some time ago, like there were like, I think 300 people that died in a plane crash in 2015, but around 10,000 people died in car crashes in the US alone. So, I mean, the knowledge is there, but it's just difficult to think about that in the moment. So that's what I meant when I said the availability bias, so that we often only think about the most recent event. So rationality, so a lot of times we don't really, I mean, it doesn't really matter what we do. So think about the story about the Pizzagate. So it's a story that I think Democrats, they had a child abuse ring in a pizzeria. And if you looked at the feedback session in the pizzeria, there were like these 1-star ratings saying that, ooh, the waiter looked strangely at my kid and things like that. So you see, I mean, they didn't really believe that. So it's more like a story that they kind of used to make a group feeling. So they decided that kind of this story provides some kind of common ground, but nobody really believed in that. Because if you think about it, I mean, if you really believe that there's a child abuse ring, you probably wouldn't give a 1-star rating, but you would call the police. I mean, another example is a quote by Sarah Pollen, who said that she rather dies than get the COVID vaccine. I mean, I'm pretty sure that she didn't mean it literally either. So often we make these decisions which are more based on tribalism, more based on what other people do. And we don't really think about it because often it doesn't really affect us. Once in a while, obviously, it does, like the COVID vaccine might have affected you. But most of the time, a lot of these decisions, like for example, the Monty Hall or other ones, they are not really affecting our real life. And there's also research that when you rephrase the questions in such a sense that it really affects your day-to-day activities, then people also act much more rational. I hope that answers your question.
That does. Thank you so much. And we have another question here. Apparently, I wasn't the only one that was a little overwhelmed by the math, but someone asked, what are good books to help us understand the math that you mentioned? Many of us find statistics and probability difficult to understand. So do you have any recommendations on books to help us understand statistics and probability better?
So I think these books that I list here on the last slide, I think they go quite in this direction. So I was quite impressed by Pinker, how easy he can explain all the details, the math and the probability. I found that very informative and very easy, approachable. I mean, if you want to go more, so even more into the math, then the first one, Clayton, the Bernoulli's fallacy, or also Ellenberg, how not to be wrong, might go, I think it's still approachable, but might go more into the details of math. And the one that from the list that probably goes most in this direction is the book by Pearl, The Book of Why.
All right, thank you so much. So we have a question that was submitted. With the knowledge of the three things that might be holding us back from making good decisions, knowledge, understanding, and rationality, how can we, once we know that, how can we put things together to make a better decision and not allow ourselves, can we use this to not get into analysis paralysis when we're trying to make decisions?
So I think, I mean, the most important part is obviously that while it's important to be humble and not to overestimate your own knowledge, it's also still important to do something. So you don't want to freeze and not do anything. So if I think about investing, for example, I mean, sometimes I find like this looks like a good investment opportunity, and then I invest, but I don't invest all my money. So I go slowly. And I think that's probably a good advice in general, that maybe you shouldn't put all your horses on one answer. Maybe you should take it slowly and see how things evolve. So there's a book by, what's his name again? It's called Super Forecasters by Tesla. And so he says, so he investigated how forecasters make good decisions. And he found that forecasters that change their decisions, they often are very good. So in other words, you have a certain prior, similar as in this Bayesian updating, you have a certain prior that something happens, and then you think about how things progress and you update your prior. So for example, if you think about whether the US will default next month, I mean, it's a really difficult question. The probability that they will default, that the US will default, is definitely not zero. The question is how high is the probability and what are you going to do with that? So if you think it's very low, but not zero, you might invest in assets that pay off when the stock market goes down. And then as time progresses, you might put more of your assets into, or get them out of the market. I mean, obviously, asset markets are always very complicated because you are not trading them by yourself. So you always need to have the edge of doing something better than the other investors. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much. The next question is, so if I have a decision to make, how do I know if my probability assigned to it is accurate?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, every question is good. But I mean, you never really know, right? In a sense, so for example, if you think about the probability whether the US will default, I mean, you just say no, right? And most likely you will be right. But how do you know the probability that there might have been a default? I mean, it's a one-time event. It will not happen again. Therefore, there's no way for you to learn the probability in hindsight. So the only thing you can do is you can compare the predictions of similar outcomes and see how often you are actually right. So let's say you think that the probability of default is like 1%. And now you have similar predictions that you make. Let's say you make another 99 similar predictions. Well, if your probability of 1% is right, then you should have that out of the 100 times, there should have been one where it actually did happen, the 1% probability case. In other words, for each individual event, you can't really say whether your probability was right or wrong, But if you pool all your predictions together, then you can.
Got it. So kind of switching back to the rationality portion of this and the discussion of tribalism, is the wisdom of the crowd more accurate than experts' predictions?
So there's research in this area. It depends on what the question is. So for example, if the question is like guessing the number of beans in a jar or guessing the weight of a cow, the crowd is always better than each individual prediction. In fact, the crowd is so much better that the average of the crowd always is much closer to the true value than any single of the predictions. And that's also partly the idea of why stock prices can be efficient, because each of us might contribute a little bit to the accurate understanding of the worth of IBM shares. So nobody of us knows it. Nobody of us knows what IBM is really worth. But if we all trade on the little knowledge we have, the average of our knowledge might reflect that quite well. So now the problem is that sometimes that backfires, and that's again related to potential biases, for example, fads like the internet boom or like meme stock craze. So that can push prices out of sync. And when you now don't have any way of pushing them down, so as I mentioned before, the limit to arbitrage, so that you would need to short sell a stock, then you might see that certain prices like CME, GameStop, AMC seem way too expensive and nothing can be done about it. So I remember at the beginning of 2021, even the New York Times, the headline was that GameStop is overpriced. But it's really difficult to do anything because you can't short sell if there's no shares available to short sell, and the borrowing fees might make it not feasible. I mean, obviously, you also have a lot of risk when you short sell, and not everybody might be willing to take this risk.
Got it. I remember that GameStop being so overpriced. I remember that situation. Funny that you brought that up. So that is our last question that we have submitted today. So on behalf of the Office of Alumni Engagement and the UB School of Management, I would like to thank Dominik for sharing his time, knowledge, and expertise with us. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and we'll send you a link within the next 24 hours. Our webinar series continues next week when we will learn more about the UB School of Architecture and Planning and its work with the UB Affordable Housing Initiative with Matthew Rowland, Assistant Dean for the Real Estate Development Program and Clinical Assistant Professor. More information on this and other upcoming webinars will be included in tomorrow's follow-up email. So thanks, make sure that you definitely check tomorrow's email for all the follow-up. This will also include a link to the webinar webpage with our webinar archives. Thank you again so much, Dominik. Thank you all for attending today's webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day and go Bulls.